Maybe what we could do is just start with a little bit, tell us about Meghan and how you got to where you are. How did your career progress?
Well, I started off really with no plan, so I'll just start there. I had no idea what I was going to do. I went to a college with the firm belief that I would go to get my master's and then figure out what I was going to do.
Right.
And after I graduated, I spent a year abroad just kind of learning French and really wanting to experience a new culture. And then came back, did my pre-med requirements to try to get into med school. And then there was just a moment where I realized, I've finished all my requirements, I realized I can't be a student for 7 more years.
Right.
And so I just kind of cracked from being kind of both poor and stressed all the time, and just recognizing that wasn't really going to change. So I opened a newspaper.
Wow.
You looked for jobs back then.
I didn't see that on your resume.
I know. But it basically led me to a job that had both French and medical kind of medical background experience requirements, and I was like, well, that is my job. And that was the job that actually, I met somebody who introduced me to my husband, and she also introduced me to somebody who got my first kind of real big job. And so I went and worked for Computer Sciences Corporation, and was basically I did that for about 5 years, and just worked at DuPont and DuPont Dow and Covance and some of these massive organizations, and it was such a excellent experience. I loved it. It was so fun, and really getting to know other people and getting to know other businesses so intimately, and just learning all about organizational change and dynamics and project planning and stuff. So it was a kind of the best foundation anyone could have, especially after that kind of slow start. But then what happened was, having met my husband during that time frame, and we got married, were pregnant, and realized there's no women between the ages of 30 and 45 at this consulting firm. Certainly not at that time. They hadn't figured out how to do remote work. Right. They hadn't figured out how to do, job sharing or part-time. And so I was really kind of forced to have to leave if that was, if I wanted to spend any time with my son. So I was planning on taking a year off, and then within probably 3 weeks, I got a phone call from my father, who was chairman of the board of Ideal Industries, which is a 107 now, I keep losing count, it keeps changing, 107-year-old family business. And he asked me to just come and work on this small project, which, as it turns out, that is how most women get involved in their family businesses. They just get asked to do one tiny little thing, and then it blossoms into this huge career. So I started working just kind of part-time, and then got kind of fully structured roles there. And I was all around governance, which it turns out I'm a huge fan of. I love governance, right. And we'll talk a lot more about governance soon. But I basically spent, did that for about 15 years with a governance lens focused on the family. So I was employed by the company, but the family really was my client. And then, during that time, that 15 years, I was named to the board of directors, the corporate board of directors, which is a majority independent board. I was asked to form a nominating governance committee for the first time, was named vice chairman, and then in February of 2020, which was a good time, by
right.
the way, those were good times,
right.
I was named chairman. And so I've been working for the company now for about 20 years, and I have found governance to be one of the most exciting spaces in the business, because you can affect so much change by moving a lot of small little pieces. You can basically change the trajectory of a business, and so it's been a real joy to become a student of governance, and a student of governance, as well as somebody who's really trying to implement good governance practices. So it's been great.
Governance is exciting. I can't think I've ever heard that said before, but I'm going to go with you on that. So you seem to have a real passion for it, and you are involved in other groups. You have clearly the Lotus Forum, which is something that you've initiated and drive. Tell me a little bit about that and what your goals are for that.
So, as I mentioned, I was named chairman in February of 2020, and I had that feeling. There was a moment when they're like, okay, you're it. And I mean, this has been a planned transition. It was planned in the sense that I was given the opportunities. I had to earn it along the way. So this was not, a fait accompli, but having achieved the results, named unanimously to the chairman role, I all of a sudden had this horrible fear. Oh my God, I can't mess this up.
Right.
Other people have gotten it right enough over the last 100 plus years, and now of course, essentially, it's not only on my shoulders, but I will be blamed if it goes down after my watch. And so I kind of, having had that fear, and then also really only having had 2 or 3 weeks before the pandemic hit. And by the way, Ideal Industries is a global manufacturing company, and we just happen to have had a facility in every single hotspot location in the world.
Wow, that's lucky.
I know. And so, and those in the beginning, nobody knew, how it was. Is it touch? Was it air? Was it, nobody knew how it was transmitted. People were dying. They didn't know how to care for these employees and people. The healthcare system was so struggling with this, and we always put our employees first. That's one of our values as a company, and it was so horrible to think that as an essential business we had to keep the doors open, but safety is such a high priority for us, and not just being so stressed about how do we keep our employees safe,
right.
And then how do you reassure them so that they're can come back, and then how do you support them when they have sick family members who then they're the primary caregivers. So it's just kind of on and on and on. It was a very, very stressful time. And also, surprisingly enough, generational transitions can sometimes be challenging in family businesses. I don't know if you've heard of this trend. And I was surprised also, given that this had been planned and communicated for years, that there was walking into the transition feeling like, all right, we've done this properly, to then realizing oh my gosh, we still have a lot, there's still a lot of loose ends and fragments and feelings that people need to resolve. And so all of that was kind of the background for starting the Lotus Forum, and really it was not purposeful. I thought that I was starting a quarterly conference call with 2 or 3 other female board chairs, and what happened was I recognized that so I needed, my thing is always phone a friend,
right.
Whenever I have a challenges, Dave, I've called you, you know this,
yep.
So phone a friend. And then I realized I didn't know any other female board chairs, and I thought that was shocking. I didn't realize that it was unique at all to be a woman in the senior leadership role in the boardroom. I just kind of was contributor, team member kind of mindset, and then walking into it realizing that there was a unique gender element to this. So that's when I reached out to my network, asked for introductions, and reaching out to these women, just said, I want to do a quarterly conference call. Who's interested? And I think I had 12 people say yes. I was like, okay, well, this is not a small informal thing. This is a thing. And so we've evolved pretty substantially. We're an international peer group of women in board leadership roles. So it's chairman, vice chairman, lead director, and then committee chairs are also welcome, because we really see all of these. It's unique to have a woman in a leadership role in the boardroom, and that is kind of this may sound not very nice, but I do believe that although companies are really transforming their businesses, and you're seeing a lot more women in the senior executive roles. You're not seeing a real substantial change in the boardroom.
Right.
And I think it's just kind of the final frontier. I think we'll get there. It's just, and we've seen a lot of, we have seen a lot of changes over the last couple of years, especially as there's our organizations and governments that are insisting on gender parity, or certainly more gender diversity in the boardroom. So we are seeing some changes, but I think it's going to take a little bit of time, especially because there's a slow turnover in boards. And so that's kind of having started the Lotus Forum. Now we have really focusing on both, how do you be a great board chair, and just all the dynamics that are happening in the board meeting and all the work that needs to be done prior to when everybody walks in that room to have it really be a strategic, to add strategic value to the company. But then we're also really spent a lot of time talking about what is on the board agenda today that your directors or you yourself as board chair may not really understand, but you have a fiduciary obligation to oversee it. And so that's when even we brought you in last year to talk about cybersecurity and how do you create a great oversight program. And I think the biggest challenge we have is, as we're building these oversight programs, I think there is still an issue of directors really not knowing, if your entire cybersecurity report is all red, is that still good? Like, you just don't know. Like, they don't know if, and so I really think that there's, I think that happens also in the, enterprise risk management, DE&I, ESG, there's kind of these big items that are coming up on the board agendas today. And I think some directors are a little bit behind in terms of having a real robust understanding of those areas.
It's interesting you talk about the directors' awareness of the issues, what to do about it. I mean, if you look at the trends that are impacting on the publicly traded side, and to a certain extent through different regulatory agencies, there seems to be a general trend around getting more understanding of that risk management at the board level. And in some cases, certainly on the publicly traded side, looking at what the SEC has done recently, it's sort of starting to accelerate that trend, right? Where they're looking for boards to be not only informed, but actually have risk monitoring in place, having expertise on the board in this space. So when you think about, you talked a little bit about the percentage of women that are on the board. There seems to be a need to, evolve the board composition, because I'll tell you, I've seen a lot of board job opportunities, and it's almost identical in every one of them, which is you've been a finance person, you've worked in our industry, or you can make introductions, right? And not a single one of them I've seen says, you understand risk management, you know cybersecurity, and the entire value chain of our business is wrapped around being able to operate, protect our intellectual property. Oh, we're going into China, what are the new risks that we're creating? There seems to be a gap in how boards recruit in many ways. But just one person's opinion, but one of the things that I'd love to get your perspective on is, for the last number of years, we've seen everybody from the World Economic Forum to other NACD, other groups who have all come out and done surveys. The big four accounting firms have all said cybersecurity is, on the minds of board members, on the minds of CEOs. It's in the top 5 worries that organizations have from a risk management perspective. Yet, my experience has been that cybersecurity, at best, might get 15 minutes once a quarter on the board agenda as a regular practice. And it's just a tactical review of what the audit committee said, and maybe the CISO gets in the room if they have one, and he or she runs through a pre-scripted, filtered set of information that the board's allowed to get. But the interesting part is, if the board is if the direction is holding board members accountable to managing that risk through their governance program, what do you think that the model is going to have to do to be able to get them to that place? Not only to change the composition of the board, the talent of the board, the way the access to information. I mean, that's a big move.
Yes, so, I mean, there's a lot in your question, but I think the biggest issue is that the people putting together the agendas, the general population of directors does not have a robust understanding of cybersecurity. And I think that, as I've learned from you, I mean, really a lot, and just wanting to educate myself in other ways, I've really come to learn that it's not just one person's responsibility to understand cybersecurity in the boardroom. We're all fiduciaries in there.
Absolutely.
And it's such a big issue, and there's so many angles to it, and there's so many potential impacts to your business. There's no way that only you can just rely on your, your CIO, your CISO, or your, CFO director who's had some experience in their other company, and just all lean on them, thinking that they've got it. I think this is every single person who is a director needs to be fully qualified to understand all of the elements of cybersecurity, and they need to continue that education. It's not a one and done, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as the technology evolves, and I mean, what we tend to see a lot of is AI this, or
Yes.
machine learning that, or OT that. It's this buzzword bingo, but that allows you to talk out loud about it, but it doesn't let you understand, how do I change my company's risk management approach when we're going to do that acquisition? How do I think about the potential risks of going into a new market, right? These are all things that so what do you think the appetite is? And I'll give you a specific example. So recently, for the first time, we've seen a corporate officer of a firm convicted criminally for failure to disclose a cyber incident. The CEO in this particular case escaped the limelight, but certainly has changed the view of many in the country in terms of their responsibility to both understand the obligations, and there are many, because there's a lot of government agencies that have gotten into the swing of it. But what do you think about that in terms of, do you think that the boardroom understands that it's in their best interest to learn this better?
I mean, I think just it's the situation of you don't know what you don't know, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's just kind of some naivete of, oh, it won't happen to us, or, we're small, we're not a target. We're not on, we don't make front page news, therefore no one's going to notice us. I just think there's some naivete there, and I'd say also, we were talking earlier about family businesses and private companies, and although there are some massive family businesses and private companies, there's also a lot of sub $100 million in revenue a year. Right. And I think that they're not less vulnerable. They just have fewer resources. Right? And so I think it becomes this, pragmatic and practicality. If you only have this many, capital resources to deploy, where do you put it? And are you bringing on another full-time person to help you manage this risk? And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say directors really need to be top, really kind of top form when it comes to cybersecurity, because sometimes that, especially if you're a smaller company, that may be your only cyber experts you have are the ones in your boardroom, right? You may be getting reports from the IT manager and, not even a cyber expert.
Right.
They have a lot of other responsibilities in keeping, servers up and stuff.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that because the company doesn't have the resources to deploy extensively, doesn't mean that the directors also then can lag in their skill sets. I think it becomes even that much more important.
Absolutely. I mean, because the bad guy actually loves the fact that that investment hasn't been made.
Yeah.
Because if you've got something of value, they're quite happy to relieve you of it, and probably not tell you about it in the process.
Right.
Right? Certainly, we've seen a number of organizations who've done acquisitions and then come later to realize that their intellectual property is actually gone.
Yeah.
Right? And it's sad, but it is a case of there is an obligation now to understand in due diligence that, historically, a lot of acquisitions, IT was kind of last to the dance.
Yes.
They were a line function sometimes with HR and others who got told, by the way, we're doing an acquisition, you haven't been allowed to be in the process, but now make it all happen. And at that point, it's a little late, right? Price has been negotiated, all the leverage is gone.
Right.
And whatever the costs are, you see, the purchase of Yahoo was a perfect example where there was $1 billion hole in the balance sheet they didn't understand, right, from a cyber perspective. So you see a lot of this kind of stuff. What do you think, because the industry has a lot of different people talking about this problem, what do you think the industry has to do to help boards and board members get better at this?
Gosh. I think it just kind of goes back to, a couple of things. You mentioned earlier, boards don't turn over very, very frequently, and you sometimes will get directors who are on 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 boards.
Yeah.
Are they going to set aside time to do their cybersecurity training? Probably not. They probably are so booked, between their boards plus whatever, vacation time with their families, like forget it. They have nothing left. And I'm not, this sounds hyperbole, and sounds disparaging, and I don't mean to be, but it's just an example. And I'd say there's a couple of things that can help remediate this issue. One is get directors who are hungry, right? You have somebody who's been on 8 boards, they have this sense of like, well, I've seen it, I've done it, but they've seen it and done it for 20 years. And the landscape from their first board role 20 years ago to the landscape of the board roles today is completely different. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And, just in terms of like the levels of responsibility, the topics that are coming up. And so I would say, if you have directors who are hungry and understand their fiduciary responsibility and the risk of getting it wrong,
right,
I think you're far more likely to create maybe a little bit of fear or enough fear so that they're then motivated to, continue their learning. I over the last 3 years, we've changed out 4 directors, and I would say that the new directors we have are far more, again, no disparagement intended, but they're very enthusiastic. They're super zeroed in on our company.
Right.
They're also not on multiple other boards. They're all we're their only other board. Or one of 2, right? And so it's not, they have full-time jobs, and they're in it every day, plus they're bringing it to the table. And I would say bringing in diversity, and also both from experience and from demographics, I think can really make a difference in terms of experience. And bringing in some younger directors who really do were more digital natives.
Right. Born digital,
right? Yeah, they were
Yeah.
born digital, right? And so I think can actually make a huge difference.
Yeah, there is a lot of talk in the industry, in the CISO community, there's a lot of trends. A lot of CISOs think that they should be on boards. They should be, for organizations that their central value proposition is technology, or it is heavy intellectual property, or a lot of complexity around that. They will tell you that they think that the answer is just put them on the board. Hire the talent, because it'll take you 10 years to train board members who are probably going to turn over anyway. Right. And they say hire the talent. You think that's realistic?
Okay, so first, yes, I think the classic, you were mentioning, board prospectuses and how they kind of look all the same. We're looking for a C-level person with our industry's experience who, can get us a network or has banking relationships, or whatever that thing is. I think that the days of staffing your boards with C-level or with CEOs or CFOs really should be gone. CEOs, I think every board should have one CEO at least, just to be, a sounding board for the company CEO. You probably need a CFO to run your audit committee, but I think that's like 2 out of how many spots, right? And then after that, absolutely, I think, especially if you can't afford, if your company's not complex enough or not big enough for you to have your own CIO or CISO, absolutely you should bring one in. That's kind of cheap advice.
It really is. I mean, we always say in the industry that if you do it right up front, it's 10 cents on the dollar, trying to fix it later, right?
Yeah,
that's the old
so true,
the adage, but it is true. I'll tell you that the places I've worked, many of the places I've consulted over the last 20 years, there are some aspects that are absolutely true. I mean, you walk in the door, you look at a huge spend that's been done to secure the environment, and maybe 5% of that has translated into value. So there's this, they bought all the tools, they bought all the equipment, they've got some people who know how to run it. Maybe they've outsourced some of it. But you go to them and you say, oh, you've got this antivirus software on your computers. What percentage of that defense is actually running? And they'll say, well, we got about 5% running. Okay, so you spend X amount of dollars and you're getting 5% return on that, and you're getting all these risks that could be stopped by that. Why'd you turn it off? They say, well, the business didn't like that it was running because it restricted them. Well, who had that conversation? Because I tell you, the board doesn't know about that, right? Except that in the world we live in now, it's starting to move closer and closer to the board being accountable for that, for that loss.
Right.
And so the interesting part is, it's not, and I've said this a few times, the amount of money you spend has absolutely no relationship to how much protection you get. You could spend, in most organizations that I've worked in, you could probably spend 10% of what the big 4 accounting firms tell you and get more protection if you deploy it smart on the priorities of the business. But it tends to be, we got to try to solve every problem. So it's an interesting world we live in, where many of the regulations that were well-intentioned have driven us to spend a lot to manage a really small amount of risk in reality. So getting more expertise on the boards, I think is a good idea. Whether it's a CISO or somebody who understands risk management, because my general assumption is board members by their nature have to be good risk managers, right? They have to look at a lot of risks across the organization. But it does seem that they're heavily weighted to, there's got to be enough finance people in the room, or people who can stare at balance sheets and go, yeah, there's a problem here, we need to fix this.
I mean, this is my philosophy. I don't want any of my directors to power down because we're not talking about their area of expertise, right? So I want everyone to, they may not be able to all talk like a CFO, but they need to understand what the CFO is saying and make, meaningful contributions to the dialogue. And same with, marketing or cyber or ESG or whatever. I want my directors to be well-rounded and then also have an area of expertise where we're trying to move the business. And so I would say that's just the one risk of having a CISO who's may not be able to contribute, or any, not to even pick on them, but any specialist who isn't going to be able to contribute to the entire dialogue. But if that's the case, then there's no reason, and this is one of the things we've talked about on our board, is really thinking about how do we bring the experts into the conversation while not requiring them to be fiduciaries, because maybe they're not well-rounded and can contribute to all conversations. So there are options of bringing in advisory board members and having them sit in your fiduciary board, but they're not fiduciaries, and they're not obligated to be, or required to talk about the whole conversation, but they're there to add their areas of expertise. And I think that is an excellent way of bringing in those specialists who are trying to, who are there to support a very strategic perspective of your company and still, keep the fiduciary nature of the board intact.
It's interesting because the one thing that I've noticed as running security for some large companies, both public and private, is that CISOs, by their nature, are one of the few functions in the organization who touch every aspect of the business. There are very few outside of maybe finance that really touch every aspect of the business, everything from supply chain all the way through the customer. And so they tend to be pretty well informed in terms of the pulse of how the organization is reacting and changing, whether it's unhappy employees who become an insider risk, or third parties that may have been, not meeting their contractual obligation to protect intellectual property, or any of those kinds of things. So it is one of those fields that I think does, whether it's as an advisor, which makes a lot of sense. One of the interesting trends we've seen in that space is that some CISOs are starting to refuse to take that title. They're refusing to take the CISO title because there is now a stigma. I don't know if you saw, there was a Wells notice issued by the SEC to SolarWinds. The Wells notice basically takes the CFO and the CISO from the SolarWinds attack of a few years ago and say, we're going to investigate the way you guys, the way that went. And so what you see is between the Joe Sullivan case in California we talked about earlier, and this and a few other things, CISOs are saying, you know what, being the CISO has a lot of liability.
Yes.
And so your point about making them advisory, whether it's them or somebody else, might be a more attractive option, because they can turn up to a board meeting and they can probably contribute fairly broadly in terms of anything that even smells like risk or operations. So that's actually a really interesting idea. So when you think about where the conversations you have with board members, is this something that's on their mind? Is this idea about getting better at cybersecurity reached its time yet, or is it still something that we know we got to get there, but I'm really busy right now?
Well, I would say, generally speaking, and not even speaking about our directors, but about kind of directors in general, I would say there is some interest, but I don't think we've reached the zenith yet.
Right.
And I think there's going to be a lot of hard lessons learned, maybe some dramatic ones, before it really starts coming into the boardroom in a very substantial way. It's that kind of innocence, which is like kind of cute. Of like, it's like, oh, well, we don't have to worry about that or whatever. And I just think it's one of those things that it's going to take time, and there probably are going to have to be some more dramatic headlines, or maybe some more, personal dramatic experiences. But I think the biggest issue is that maybe not that others don't recognize that this is a problem, but what do they do? I feel like that's the big question. Like that is if you have limited resources, if you have all these other competing priorities, you've got to make capital investments. How do you do it in a smart way? And I don't think that a general director has the ingrained knowledge to be able to advise companies or management team on what to do or where to find that support. And I think that's really the biggest challenge. It's not that they don't know, it's like they know the risk is there, but they don't know how to address it.
What do you do with it?
Yeah, right. What do you do about it, right? And so
you just told me all this black cloud stuff. Now what do I do?
So I think there probably are questions being asked in the boardroom, but again, this is my example of, if you ask a question about cybersecurity because you read an article or you took a class, and you talk to the CIO or whoever's running, the cybersecurity program, how do you know what's a good answer?
Right.
And I think that's what's difficult. I mean, that is what's really difficult about this environment today, is that it is very technical, and there are a lot of really smart directors in the boardroom today, but are they just, this is an area that's really out of their depth, and especially if we're looking, you were mentioning earlier just around the slow turnover in the boardroom, average age of boards is, probably higher than one would want. And, again, very generally speaking, but they did not grow up, these individuals did not grow up in their board experience with needing to have these conversations.
Yeah, it's an interesting evolution that has to happen because, from my side, what I see is, and not to pick on the big four, but and I tend to use them a lot as an example, but there's a lot of commoditization in business as it grows, to get scale. And our industry is the same. IT, cybersecurity, and as organizations get bigger, it becomes more about, as an advisor, I want to get butts in seats with my clients so I can be there and drive billables, and I'm, in many ways, I'm incented to not solve the problems immediately.
Yeah.
Whereas at the board level, it's the last thing you want to be doing is dragging this stuff out forever. You want to monitor, but you want to have a solution that makes sense, that enables the business, and then be able to monitor the results and the investment. And I think that there has to be a better solution. I know that I've certainly thought about it and saying, how could we create something that a board member could use to get the answers to those questions and be able to a certain extent, pressure test the information they're being given. And I think that's something that we're going to continue to work on, to be able to offer that is how do I help board members be able to go to a place to get the answer, without having to go get a master's degree in cybersecurity,
right?
Because they're going to manage a lot of risk.
It's also unrealistic, right? And that also, part of what you're doing in the boardroom is assessing the senior management team. And if your senior like a member of your senior management team is saying things you literally do not understand, how are you is that is that good? Is they really smart? Have you been able to do your job as a fiduciary? I think that's just the big question. And the world's evolving really fast. The boardroom moves a little bit slow, and I think it just has resulted in this a really big exposure for all directors. And I don't think there's general knowledge of the risk of, having cybersecurity issues disclosed to you and then not following up on the issue get resolved.
We talked about this before, and you gave me some advice, but I gotta put it on camera now, right? So, because this is a really interesting thing. So there's this assumption that makes me crazy in our business, which is it's not if, but when you get hacked.
Right.
Which is, in my opinion, not helpful. Right. Because it takes away it takes away the assumption that you can do something about it. And you absolutely can. There are solutions, there are abilities to get in front of this stuff, and for those who say that's not true, I would suggest that they're incented by that, right? But with that said, if you think about this whole idea around getting expertise and getting it in front of folks and being able to share information with them. One of the challenges we've seen in the marketing side of the house is the industry's got 3,000 companies in this country that are all pushing messages at every audience, whether it's the CEO, the board, or anybody else. And they struggle to wade through this massive amount of data. So even if you can get an information to boards, they're probably swamped with so many different opinions that have different agendas. It's hard to wade through and know what's true, much less come up with a strategy if it's successful. And so we have a responsible disclosure program that I told you about, where our threat intelligence team detects a threat that's in development. And you're going to be ransomwared in 3 days, and here's where it's going to come from, and here's how you stop it. and we reach out to the company, and they won't return our call. And then 3 days later, you see them get ransomware. And it's sad. It's very demoralizing, but everybody we've talked to has said, well, you know, they've been marketed to so much, they don't believe anything anymore. And that was, to me, I don't know how we get over that problem, and I've asked a lot of people this question, but it seems like this idea that it's not if but when has created a scenario where people have just tuned out to the reality that you can do something about it. And so, you know, do you think that the amount of information that comes at directors in general is just so overwhelming across all the subject matter areas that it makes it difficult to get the message through?
Well, I think there's you know, it's trying to find those trusted sources, right? So when you think about financial advisors who sell products versus financial advisors who provide, you know, a service, and then you go choose what you need. I mean, I think that's really the difference, right? I mean, or you know, someone who's assessing your insurance needs and then also wants to sell you the policy, like, all right, how good was that advice?
Right.
And not to say that there's, you know, there isn't a lot of great advice being provided, but I think that's really the big question. And I wonder if there aren't services out there that people could subscribe to where you know, you're just getting the data and you're not going to get sold to then, you know, right the next thing. Because I think it's just finding those reliable sources and also recognizing that, you know, again, I think it comes back to also the board really understanding what those people are saying to you also. Yeah.
And that is a challenge because you think about there's manufacturing, there's finance, there's technology, there's legal, there's all these things, right? And it's a lot to cumulatively see. For me as a risk person, I look at, here's the business situation, I know what questions to ask and where likely it's going to end up anyway, because you've seen it 1,000 times.
Right.
And I think like every subject matter expert, they can do that.
Right.
But then the role of the board is to look at it cumulatively across all of the business and say, here's the right thing for us. We'll take that risk, we won't take that risk, you know. And I think that is, the subject matter experts, you know, I think you make a great point, which is, how do I get a good opinion in front of you without it being a sales effort?
Correct.
Right. And I think that's a challenge. I don't think that truly exists in its pure form, but it's interesting.
Wouldn't that be the thing to do is you have, you know, you just have a subscription service, but, you know, we'll just let you know when it's coming down the pike, and you can determine how to proceed, and
right.
There's no add-ons.
Right, yeah, there's no click here to buy it.
Yeah, you can, like, you're no upselling, but then I think that would actually probably be really helpful, because again, there's this concern, you know, especially with all the IT investments that are happening today anyway, and, you know, now people are like freaking out about AI, but I think that if they knew where to focus those investments based on real data, not versus, you know, what someone's trying to sell you, right? Do you want the undercoating on your new car? Like,
do you want the insurance at Best Buy?
Yeah, exactly, right? So I think that's really the big question.
So we're talking maybe a little bit like the Consumer Reports for a cyber threat, right?
I think people will go for it. And I don't think, and then people would know really how do you know, then they would know, you know, where do they need to kind of ramp up, especially if we're talking, you know, those smaller private companies that don't have, you know, vast IT departments who are, and, you know, CISOs and everybody, you know, the whole team. I mean, wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about, because we do interact with a lot of $200 million companies, and we always say that, you know, most businesses start considering a CISO around, depending on their risk profile, around $1 billion in revenue. Right? It's about where we start to see it happening, unless you're in medical research or something else. But typically that's where we start to see it. But I was quite surprised to learn that there are thousands of firms in the United States under $1 billion in revenue, many of them privately held.
Yes, thousands.
Yeah. And so you think about that every
Yeah.
one of them is a target in one way, shape,
And
or
they're
form.
probably, almost none of them have, deployed all the resources required, even for companies half that size, because they have other priorities.
Right. It's interesting, though, you think about there's a certain amount of spend that goes on in every company. Well, we need to have email, and we need to have computers, and we need to have these things. But if they had good advice up front, they could minimize the spend and make it more secure from the beginning.
Yeah.
So some of those problems would never show up.
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it.
It's interesting. One of the things we talk about all the time in our industry is there's this assumption that everybody's going to get ransomware. Right? This ransomware is going to come out. And I say, well, there's actually technologies that are kind of impervious to ransomware, that you can use those things, but nobody asked that question. Well, if we're going to build it, why not build it in a way that's more secure? Doesn't show up in the strategic conversation. Say think about a board thinking about M&A. Hey, we're going to, I've done 35 major acquisitions in the companies I've worked at, and they go and say, all right, we're going to buy this company in Romania. Great company. Okay, cool. So here are the security risks for Romania. And if you operate it from Hungary instead, and do all your call centers and all that from there, your cost of security goes down by 80%. They're like, wow, okay,
Right.
didn't understand that.
Right.
Will that change how you negotiate and what you're willing to pay for it? And by the way, what about the intellectual properties? Do they actually still own it? And all of these kinds of things. And I think that there is value that can be captured by organizations by engaging further in those discussions, because we see these statistics every day, and we probably see a dozen companies auctioned off for sale on the dark web every day, right? Every day. And we try to we have a lot of mission-focused people, and we try to alert them, and we try. I did 5 this morning before we got here to this interview, just reaching out to CTOs and CIOs going, hey, just let me send you the document, just so I'm not trying to sell you anything. And I think that, as this volume continues to grow, it's one of our board members, John Waters, who recently was the president of Mandiant, and they sold it to Google, and very, very smart guy, said to he said to me one day, he says, look, if you look at the risks and the amount of losses that have occurred in the U.S. market over the last 20 years, right? Go back to 2010 and you use that as a benchmark, and you came through and said, okay, 2020 we're maybe 1.3% of global GDP was lost to cyber attacks. And if you trend that out to 2030, you're talking about 3.5% of global GDP. Now that's the economic impact of COVID every single year going forward. That in itself should get a board interested in this from an economic reality. Because in my humble opinion, the people who are going to bear the costs of that loss are the people who are least prepared to defend it. Do you think that those kind of realities of the cost to economies in general is understood at the board level, or do you think that's we need more education around these laws? Because it's in the Wall Street Journal, right? Everybody reads it.
Yeah.
But
no, I would say, no, I definitely think there needs to be more education. There needs to be more awareness. There needs to be, and I would say the conversation needs to be had in ways and kind of, layman's terms, right? Because that's the other thing is that, there may be, this information may all be available, but how do you, can people read it and understand, what they're saying? So I think that's kind of the other big issue.
That brought up two thoughts for me. The first is, are boards good at asking for what they need from their subject matter experts, do you think?
I think I think absolutely they do in matters they really understand. So, you always bring in a comp expert every year to go through exec comp, or, you always are bringing in your outside professional to run your board evaluations or your CEO evaluations, So I think there are a lot of third parties that will come in and advise and, bringing in, some real outside expertise. But I'll say that that's not, that's certainly in the boards that I've served on, I haven't seen, you've seen the comp experts, you see the governance experts, you see tax experts. Have you seen a security expert?
That speaks business?
Right. I mean, no.
My humble opinion, it's a small number of my compatriots who have gotten proficient at that business language speak.
Right, and so you're bringing in, so you have your audit teams are coming in and reporting to the audit committee, but, do you have your, third-party security folks coming in and giving you just kind of updates? No, like, that's not conversations that are happening today, and I think it's really good point. And probably needs to be as, as common if we're spending all this time talking about, internal audits.
Right.
Which
is
doing
not managing much risk.
Right. I mean, right. In the end, it's all the right things to do, and I'm not knocking it. But at the same time, then, why aren't we having these broader conversations?
Well, I mean, everybody drives down the road every day, and there's speed limit signs, and you wouldn't want to live in a world without them.
Right.
Right. And you wouldn't want your teenager on the road without them. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like compliance to me. Right? You wouldn't want to live in a world where there isn't an audit process and a compliance program and those kinds of things. But that in itself is not the panacea of protecting the organization.
Agreed.
Right? Okay, my last sort of question before we close up would be around, if you think about how management teams are incented, right? CEOs especially, but others, around progress of the business, overall results, growth, any number of other things. In some organizations, I've seen where there was somewhat of a disincentive to talk at the board level or allow conversation at the board level about things that were the baby's ugly, as it were. And if you think about how the risk is changing. So here's the inside story. My personal record is having my presentation to the board filtered 52 times before I was allowed to present it.
What?
52 times between the executive team. And in the end, I refused to present it.
Smart.
I said, it's your presentation now, not mine. It doesn't actually tell them anything.
Yeah.
And so they said, all right, just go back to what you're going to do. But the pressure on CISOs to
pretty it up or something.
Pretty it up and to change the language that's not confrontational or in any way controversial is very significant. And in many cases, well, as we saw with the Joe Sullivan case, they often end up paying the price for it. The average tenure of a CISO for the last 10 or 15 years has been between 17 and 24 months.
Oh my God.
On average. Little longer in the privately held business.
Yeah.
But it is not, they get hung with the compliance failure a lot.
Yeah.
So I guess the question that I've got, and I've done a lot of research on this, but is, do you think that the role for governing cybersecurity between the board and what the management team's responsibility and obligation is clear or clear enough? The difference between those two.
So I think this is, I really feel like this is a delicate balance because I want to know the truth, but I don't want to beat anyone up about it. It's just facts.
Right.
We can't do anything about it unless we know.
Right.
And so I really tried to take the approach, and I'm in boards that are very congenial, but honest. So it's not shoving stuff under the rug. But I've really made a point of trying to, especially if you're getting stuff like this, a work in progress. We're not where we want to be, and of course in cyber, you're never done. There's no all your dials are not going to turn green. I'm sorry to say, that's just life. And so I really do try to remind the board as we're coming into these conversations that this is a work in progress. We want to know, it's important to disclose, and if there are material issues, we do need to follow up, but it's only just to close that governance gap. It's not for, punishment or anything else. And I think that's really trying to take that perspective, I think makes people feel, feel more comfortable in being honest. But I would also, if their board director ever was kind of trying to, go too far with, how did you let this happen? Or
right.
the equivalent, I would intervene, because I don't think that's appropriate. And it doesn't engender trust, which is a huge issue between the management team and the board. People have to know they can come in and tell you the truth,
right.
and you're there to help them win. You're not there to beat them up. And so that's, I think, a lot of the board dynamics that we've been working on in our board, is really just trying to make sure that the management and board has a very strong working relationship, and that they know each other and can trust each other. And we put a lot of stuff in place so we can do that. Because you want the management team to walk in and think, this is the only place on the planet where everyone is here helping me be better. It doesn't mean it's all the messages are going to be awesome,
Right.
but they're there to make you better. It's not, beating up for recreational purposes or anything else. But I think I think it's tragic that a CEO would ever feel like they had to tailor something for the board. If there ever is that instinct, it would mean either one of two things: you have the wrong board or the wrong CEO. Because if everything's going to be whitewashed before it gets into the boardroom, what is the purpose of having a board, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. That is a great question. Well, so, to wrap up, I guess, you've got a lot going on. You're on a number of boards. You've got the Lotus Forum. What's next for you? What is the next challenge for you look like? You've got your own company, which has got a huge amount of history and doing very well by all accounts. What's the next few years look like? What are you going to focus on?
Oh my gosh, I always have a long list. I'm an inveterate learner, so I just finished my ESG certification. I was a 6-month program. I thought I was going to die. I hadn't taken a test in years, but it's good. It's a great experience, and I feel a lot more prepared to really kind of embark on that journey with our board and our company. Finishing up a risk class. I'm doing a cyber class.
Nice.
Hopefully we'll do that soon, and then after that, I just kind of a bunch of. I really think it's very important for continuous learning, to just really stay fresh. And I think as board chair, I feel an obligation to really be kind of on the leading edge of where I need and want the board to go based on where the company's advancing. So I think there's going to be a lot of work in that area. So
excellent. Well, look, I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to come down here. And I think that your advice is going to help so many people out there to understand this issue. It's rapidly evolving, so thank you very much.
Dave, thank you. I appreciate it.